Okay, so we move into chapter 3, and in chapter 3 we want to basically we're going to talk a lot about personal income, and as we mentioned, this class is about business tax, but the reason this fits into this course is because businesses have a lot to do with how their employees and the people that they hire and pay are taxed and paid, and how it's all administered. So that's why it's here. So here's a simple scenario, representative scenario. We've got a co. I've got them as a corporation. They don't have to be a corporation, but easier to think about for most people. So a co is a corporation, and they make an agreement with a person, worker, who will provide services, and a co will pay them. So the question then becomes, is worker an employee of a co? So obviously you're going to ask a question. The answer must matter. So why does it matter? Well, it matters to both parties. So let's just take a quick look. So again, remember our options here are: 1, worker will be considered self-employed and entering into this agreement as its own, as his or her own business. Let's just call him a him. So worker's a man, and he's entering into this agreement as a business himself. So he's self-employed, or he's an employee. Those are the two choices here. And so from a co's perspective, there are pros and cons to him being, so let's do this, to being self-employed. Okay, to not, like, a co can't be self-employed, but the individual. So to this being entered into between a self-employed worker and a company. So from a co's perspective, one of the great things about them being self-employed is that their administration is much less. And what that means is they don't have to withhold taxes. They can just pay him like they pay anybody else, that they pay all their suppliers and all of those things, so withholding taxes. And also things like EI and CPP, they're not responsible for. Also, benefits. There are usually not very many benefits that have to be paid, so I didn't draw these columns very nicely, did I? So this is all in the con column, or sorry, in the pro column. And if when we get to some cons, we'll put them over there. There's also this idea of they're easier to get rid of, right? So if you have someone who is not your employee, there's the labor laws and things like that don't govern what you have to do. But in the con column, there are things like loyalty and continuity that suffer, right? Because if your entire workforce is made up of self-employed people, then there's not this sense of, we are all contributing to a co. There's more a sense of everybody is working for themselves. And so it isn't without cost, but you can see some of these are tax costs and some of them aren't. Well, what about from, let's change this, and what about from workers' perspective? So from workers' perspective, and again, we'll keep the point of reference being self-employed. So for the worker, the pros of being self-employed, and we'll be smarter this time, we'll put a line between them before we start. So the pros of being self-employed are, 1, you're running a business. And when you're running a business, more expenses are deductible. Now, on the surface, this should not be an issue. If the system worked perfectly, this actually wouldn't matter. But when you're an employee of a company, there's very little that you are allowed to deduct from away from your income before you get to taxable income. And so it's a fact that really shouldn't be there, but it is. The other pro is that you have freedom and independence. So if you don't really like what's going on under this contract, there's nothing that compels you to take the next one. But of course, every coin has two sides, right? So the freedom that you have to do there is also going to cost you over in the con column. You are not going to have things like benefits, pensions, health. Rarely do companies offer these to contractual people. your job security is going to be much less secure. And also things like EI, which are a big deal. So you will get no maternity leave or all the other things that you can get if you suddenly become unemployed because you weren't employed in the first place. So there are pros and cons, and also, I mean, you can see that there's going to be any of these factors over here. They kind of, you can see the mirror image on the other side. So that's why it matters. So then the question is, well, now that we know that it matters a little bit, how do we decide? And so in the reading for the week, we tell you to look at paragraph 1141 of Beam, Lakin, and Barnett. And I would tell you to go there quickly just to understand how this all works. But essentially, I'll give you the really high level. Case law determines all this. So when things go to court, they get decided. And when it gets decided, the judges who decide it have to give something that is called the reason for the judgment. So they have to support why they ruled the way that they did. It has a fancy Latin name, but we'll call it reason for judgment. And that reason is binding. So whatever they say, okay, we did this because of this. And binding, as opposed to, there's lots of different terms that float around here, but that's more than, so versus persuasive. There are other things in law that are persuasive, meaning you have to look at them, but they don't bind you. But binding means you have to follow it. So in the case of employed versus self-employed, what that means is if you have a similar fact pattern, then you can infer that you will have the same outcome as the case that was decided. What that means is don't bother coming to court. You can't come to court and argue a case that has already been decided because that outcome was binding on you. However, what this hinges on, though, is similar. And every fact pattern can usually be argued to be not quite similar. And so cases do end up coming to court that look like they are a fair bit like ones before, but they aren't. But in the case of employed versus self-employed, there have been a number of cases that are fairly definitive. And what the current state of affairs right now is that the case law tells us that there are essentially three tests that get used to decide whether or not for self-employed or employed. Okay. Now, again, this comes out of case law. What you have to really keep in mind with these three tests is that it is not an all or nothing. So it's not all or nothing, and I don't know how better to say this. Basically, it's not, for anybody who has a background, it's not a litmus test. A piece of paper is not going to turn a color and tell us what the outcome is. So the three tests basically give you guidance. The tests provide guidance, but at the end of the day, it will come down to argument, one side or the other. Okay, so let's just note that. They provide guidance. They don't tell us, they don't answer the question for us directly in most cases. So what are the three tests? Well, one of them is called the economic reality test. And what that is actually it has three components. So one of them is the control test, and basically the way I always think about this one is control over what? Control over what is done and how it is done. Okay, so you think about most employees, they are told what you have to do and how you have to do it. So the second one is ownership of tools. So you have to identify what the tools are. So this is the key. What are the tools and who owns them? So if ACO owns all of the tools that worker is using to do what it is he's been hired to do, then he looks more like an employee than a contractor. And then the last one is this risk-reward continuum. So who's bearing the risk of this? It is often called the chance of profit, risk of loss. Who bears that? If ACO bears it all, then the person looks like an employee. The second test is the integration test. And what this really comes down to is, at least in my mind, is economic independent. Well, you can write it either way, but I'll write it as independence. So the more economically independent worker is from ACO, the more he looks like a contractor. And this administratively comes down to things like proportion of workers' income that comes from A, and things like benefits. So if I need this contract in order to survive, I look like I'm dependent on them, and therefore I look like an employee. And then the last test is this idea of a specific result. And this one ends up being pretty informative in this day and age because it's more common for people to be hired, do this one thing, and then who knows whether you'll stay around or not. So kind of a project-based thing. And it is exactly what you would expect it to be. There's this idea of a defined objective. So we're bringing you in, you're going to lead this team, versus the normal employee is just there to provide work, whatever that means, on an ongoing basis. So ongoing sort of means we will hire you and oh goodness, sorry, and nobody really knows when this is all going to end. So we look at these things, we factor them in, and we come up with a decision. But it's never simple.